thank everybody for joining us. I'm Matthew Stepp. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. I run their Energy Innovation Policy Shop. For anybody that's not familiar with ITIF, Jane, can you mute your screen? There we go. We're going to push through this technology issues. So if you're not familiar with ITIF, we're a policy think tank, about 10 years old. You're in our space. We work on innovation and technology policies. Energy is one of our verticals. We also do biotechnology, manufacturing, research, tax, trade issues, cover the gamut. We're hosting this event partially to release a report, which we have the executive summary in the back. You can download the full report. It's 50 pages long, so we're not trying to kill the trees. So you can download that off our website at itif.org. But we're having this event really because we believe this is a central clean energy and climate policy issue. And it really comes down to one about clean energy technologies, global market readiness. But before I'm going to give the context of the discussion and report. I just want to get a few things out of the way first. ITIF believes very strongly that climate change is real. It's one of the most serious issues challenging the world. And really what that means is the world must dramatically reduce greenhouse gas emissions as quickly as possible. And doing so requires no less than a transformation of the global energy system. And I want to emphasize that word global, because I think that's key. And that means moving from fossil fuels to clean energy technology. So we're by no means climate deniers, anti-clean energy folks. We want to get this right. We want to solve climate change. And I think that's important, particularly as you're reading the report, because the title may lead you to believe otherwise. But with all of that said, I think we disagree with most climate advocates that believe the world has all of the low-carbon technologies needed to facilitate this transformation. And those folks believe that all that's really left is to dramatically deploy existing technologies as much as possible. We call this view in the report the clean energy deployment consensus, and we kind of spell out its roots and the type of advocates and policymakers that meet that consensus. But as Megan's going to go in a bit more detail, the reason for this are really because the reasons why the deployment consensus in our view is misguided is that today's technologies are often too expensive or too performance limited, depending on the technology we're talking about. And they're too limited in the sense that we can't leverage them to get the worldwide transformative rates of decarbonization necessary to mitigate climate change. We like to say that we're not talking about American warming, we're talking about global warming. We're not trying to just decarbonize the United States, we're trying to decarbonize the world. And to be clear, we're not saying clean energy technologies such as renewables cannot play a leading role in reducing global emissions. They must. They've certainly gained a niche foothold with the help of generous subsidies, portfolio standards in the states, and along with natural gas have helped actually reduce U.S. emissions by a few percentage points. And even in some niche cases, we recognize renewables are near cost competitiveness, and even in some cases at competitiveness. But what we're really saying is if we want the dramatic transformation that we need, which is 80% or more greenhouse gas reduction globally, then today's technologies are not up for that task without overwhelming subsidies that governments are unable to invest, stringent mandates that potentially raise energy prices, or politically infeasible carbon prices. We just don't fundamentally believe we're going to be able to get that on a global scale. So by themselves, these type of policies aren't going to get us deep emission reductions, so we argue that we need cheaper, better, clean energy technologies to get this global transformation. That means more innovation. Yet the dominant view of many climate advocates, which we define as a deployment consensus, are that policymakers we don't need significant tech breakthroughs. We need political breakthroughs to drive this widespread deployment. And we often hear the most that innovation is either not needed or will happen on its own through more deployment or through market forces. And innovation is often used as a buzzword to sell any and all clean energy policies, most recently kind of as a green jobs way of selling different policies through the Stimulus Act. And many advocates typically pay lip service to energy innovation policy, often equating it to just R&D, rather than the spectrum of dynamic institutions and policies that it actually is. So we're having this debate, I think, to clear this up and I think really to push the idea that really we need to get serious about a comprehensive innovation strategy if we really want to mitigate climate change. And we often hear, we've been doing this for a few years now. We often hear that this kind of debate about do we need innovation policies or not is immaterial, that we're going to get that innovation anyway. And the policy kind of debate really doesn't matter. But really this consensus, this deployment consensus actually has a real impact on climate and energy policy. For example, since 2009 when the stimulus invested significantly in clean energy, 71% of federal investments have gone to deploying existing technologies through efficiency grants and tax credits. Once those stimulus investments die down, funds for R&D and Technology Valley of Death investments dropped 30% to $5 billion per year, while deployment expenditures tripled to almost $11 billion. And then these numbers, I think match really well with global investment as well, so it's not just US-centric. So there's I think the consensus has a very real impact on climate policies. And I think just to give you a couple of recent examples, take a look at Joe Rome's piece yesterday at the Center for American Progress, saying that we don't need research, which he equates as innovation. All we need is a carbon price. Or take a look at Paul Krugman in the New York Times book review this weekend, arguing along a similar line. You can see how, and we go kind of in depth in the report, see how this deployment consensus kind of takes hold in the policy advocacy space. So to discuss, I think, this topic, we have a great panel, and we're going to each speaker is going to have 7, 8, 9 minutes or so to give some responses to the report, and then we're going to have a discussion and go to the audience, obviously. Just to give some very brief introductions to our panelists, Megan Nicholson works with me at ITIF. She's a policy analyst specializing in clean energy policy, and she's done a lot of really great work on DoD energy innovation ecosystems and the federal budget as it pertains to energy policy. And she's going to give a brief overview of the report. To her left, Armand Cohen's the co-founder and executive director of the Clean Air Task Force, which is really one of the, especially behind the scenes, one of the leading thinkers when it comes to energy innovation policy, just energy policy in general. And they're, in my opinion, the go-to technology policy folks for things like carbon capture and sequestration, nuclear power, and such. The talking head that's on both of our screens, Dr. Jane Long, recently retired from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where she was the Principal Associate Director and Fellow at the Center for Global Strategic Research and the Associate Director for Energy and the Environment. Jane's got a very long, storied history in energy technology and energy policy. She was the chairwoman for the California Council on Science, California's Energy Future Committee, which released one of the reports that we discuss at length in our report, and she'll be giving kind of an overview of her takeaways from that process. And then also we have Margot Anderson, who's the executive director of the Energy Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and she's done some great work along with her colleagues at BPC for the America's Energy Innovation Council, which I think all of you should know. Bill Gates, Chad Holliday, Norm Augustine, other business titans calling for increased support for energy innovation. And she has a decade-plus history at the Department of Energy and just, again, a really, I think, key thinker in this space. So before we dive into, go right to Megan, just a couple of housekeeping items. In terms of logistics, each speaker will get no more than 10 minutes. To facilitate discussion outside of this event, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We've partnered with ourenergypolicy.org, and we have a one-pager in the back of the room that kind of talks about who they are. But they're going to host an expert discussion on this issue on their website, ourenergypolicy.org. And you can, if you want to participate as an expert in that discussion, just go to that website and sign up. But so this will be kind of a way of continuing this discussion outside of this event, and also kind of, if you've ever tried to have discussions in forums online or in the comments section, it can get a little, I think, crazy sometimes. So this is, I think, a more, rational and good debate methodology. So check that out. The one page is in the back of the room. And so to start the discussion, we will go to Megan.
evening, and thanks for coming. So everyone's probably familiar with the statistics I'm going to lay out, but I'm just going to spew some numbers for a second. The IPCC suggests that we need to reach 80% emission reductions globally by 2050 in order to avoid the worst effects of climate change. This basically means we need decarbonization rates of at least 5% per year. And the only time that we've ever reached such high decarbonization rates was in 1981 during a massive recession in the United States. Since 2000, the average rate of annual decarbonization has been less than 1%. So just some food for thought as we go into this discussion. If we're to reach these carbon reduction goals by 2050 without relying on another period of economic contraction, we need climate policies that are scalable to this challenge. Today's energy and climate policy conversation, as Matt said, is dominated by discussions of how to encourage the deployment of clean energy technologies, either by making the cost of conventional or dirty energy go up, by subsidizing renewables, or by regulating and mandating their use. Unfortunately, these policy options don't address the key to mitigating climate change, which is to make clean energy as cheap or cheaper than fossil fuels. Globally, consumers are unwilling to pay a premium for clean energy, even in the face of climate change. While deployment is an important piece of the innovation ecosystem that can drive these reductions in cost, it will only access incremental cost improvements, not the technology breakthroughs that we need to make clean energy competitive with fossil fuels. In order to advance the innovation narrative within the climate and energy policy space, we looked at several of the studies the deployment consensus cites as evidence that we have all the clean energy technologies that we need currently to meet global energy demand in this country and globally in the next 20 to 40 years. These studies present possible renewable energy futures that can be technically realized with significant deployment. Our intention wasn't to critique the findings of the studies or their conclusions themselves, but to point out that the conclusions of the studies are much more complicated and sometimes the recommendations significantly more costly than the deployment consensus lets on. We found 4 key problems with the deployment consensus interpretation of this literature. First, the deployment consensus often downplays the significant and likely infeasible renewable generation capacity scale-up in the scenarios. So, for example, one of the studies contends that to meet 100% renewables by 2030, the U.S. must install 12.5% more wind capacity and 12.5 times more wind capacity and 50 times more solar capacity per year until 2030. Another one of the studies estimates that shifting to 100% renewable future globally by 2030 will likely cost $100 trillion. Just a big number. Essentially, this is 8% of global GDP per year for 20 years. So our second critique was that the deployment consensus often underplays the need for innovation and cost declines in energy storage technologies, which will be necessary at high levels of renewable penetration. Many of the storage technologies necessary to meet high levels of renewable penetration are still in development and must see further cost declines. In fact, the California Energy Study, which was co-authored by our guest, Jane Long, directly recognizes this problem, that very few energy storage technologies, even in development, would be able to manage multiple gigawatt days of energy storage needed at a high renewable penetration scenario. In addition to the California study, most of the reviewed studies actually acknowledge that storage innovation would make the proposed scenarios more accessible. Our third critique was that some of the reviewed studies limit the technology options in their future scenarios to wind, water, and solar. These studies make these certain assumptions because they're framed around investigating how renewable technologies can meet energy demand reliably under a high penetration scenario, not necessarily how to reduce greenhouse gases most effectively. The California study is unique in this respect as it is motivated by a goal to reduce the state's carbon emissions 60% from 1990 levels by 2050. By excluding nuclear, by excluding nuclear, natural gas, and biofuels and other low-carbon technologies from a renewable energy future, limits the opportunities for reducing greenhouse gas emissions as quickly and cheaply as possible. And lastly, our fourth critique of this interpretation is that the studies that do propose policy recommendations for realizing a renewable future, usually the dominant suggestion is to create policies that induce innovation, which can be considered a carbon tax, a cap and trade system, or regulations. And this kind of strategy can possibly introduce incremental technology improvements, but radically cost-reducing breakthroughs call for a well-developed innovation strategy. The studies cited by the deployment consensus actually show why innovation is fundamentally important to developing cheap and performance-competitive clean energy and to addressing climate change. The narrow focus of the energy and climate policy on deployment alone is detracting from the other pieces of the innovation ecosystem. More policy focus on supporting the full life cycle of clean energy innovation, which could be research, development, demonstration, prototyping, and what we suggest in the report is considered smart deployment policies that better link research to market than our current policies, are necessary to enable breakthroughs and significant cost declines in clean energy generation and storage. Thank you.
Good. Thanks. And am I live here? Am I coming through? Okay, got it. Thanks for the wind up there, Megan. I have a few comments that I think are broadly consistent. I guess my first comment is that I think it's hard in this debate to avoid the problem of tastes great, less filling. I mean, in a sense, we need both. We need deployment is not completely distinct from innovation, but where you are on that spectrum is quite important in getting the mixes right. In an ideal world, we'd be doing lots of deployment of everything we have, and we'd be beating doors down on innovation and demonstration. That's not the world we live in. Places like Germany are already beginning to feel the constraint on deployment of current generation technology. The renewable charge on the German bills are now headed to about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, which is almost the retail price in some parts of the United States. So, how far they're going to go down that road is not clear, and I'm not going to say whether or not they should go down that road, but it's clear that at some point this all binds, and to some extent you do have to start thinking about resource allocation. So my first comment is there's nothing inherently at odds between deployment and innovation. In fact, sometimes they run quite in parallel, and in fact are inextricably linked. The problem is what kind of innovation, I think, as Megan was saying. Broadly speaking, we've observed two kinds of innovation. I'm going to use the wind industry as an example for a second. The first kind of innovation is around reducing the risk of new technologies. Things like demonstrating the technical performance. Does it actually work? What's its rough cost at commercial scale? And what can we do to further reduce costs and improve performance, and then reduce investment risk, so that these things can actually get uptake in the marketplace. That's one kind of innovation which you might call fundamental. Another kind of innovation is just reducing the construction and operating costs of a kind of clean energy technology, improving the technical performance incrementally, and move it towards competitiveness with commercial alternatives. If we look at the wind industry as an example, we've actually done really good on the second. You've all seen those cost curves, the declining cost curves for wind power. The latest report from LBL has Lawrence Berkeley Labs has the declines actually kind of reaching a plateau, though. I mean, we've sort of had a lot of decline over the last 10 years, no doubt due to a lot of the incentives for large scale deployment. The kind of innovation we've seen, though, is at the edges. It's more about things like cheaper turbines, taller towers, bigger blades, those sorts of things that are extrapolations of the existing technology, and that's all good. Those are important things to have happened. But as I think the report discusses, the next frontier for variable renewables like wind is dispatchability, integration. There are studies out there that suggest that integrating large amounts of wind power into the grid might even double the cost of wind. the backup, the ancillary services, and so forth. So there, we've been talking a lot to wind developers who have ideas about how to actually work with wind technology to increase its value to the grid and its integration with the grid and reduce these integration costs. And there are a bunch of ideas out there in electronics, in the kinds of couplings that you might have between storage and wind and so forth. In the offshore area, there's some radical ideas, for example, floating wind turbines and the like. The problem with all these innovations is that they aren't going to do well, they aren't going to show up in a production tax credit, investment tax credit world, or a renewable portfolio standard world, because investors are not going to take the risk associated with these big step changes. And that's, I think, what the report is saying, is that there's this sort of step change, transformational piece that it just doesn't fit well with the pricing scheme, because typically these things can be twice, 3 times more expensive than what's on the market. So if I'm a investor in wind power, for example, why should I do that when I can reap the benefits of the renewable portfolio standard by doing a standard design, maybe tweaked a little bit to increase my margin, but not something fundamental like a floating offshore wind turbine. The way, I think what the report helpfully says is that there are ways to do incentives that are a lot smarter. Smart deployment, I like that term because it really it embodies both the fact that we're not just talking about R&D, we're not just talking about tinkering around the lab, we're going to have to build stuff to improve it. So if you take something like carbon capture and storage, I would argue we don't need a whole lot more R&D right now. What we need is to build the first 3, 5, 7, 10, and we're going to learn a lot, and that's going to identify the kinks and where we can even make some radical changes. Although I would continue R&D in some of those areas. We're going to learn a lot by deployment. So I think that the report points in a good direction. I think the next step is really to see if we can maybe get beyond this debate and get everyone to agree that we need, at least in parallel, a pretty aggressive program of targeted deployment with innovation in mind. In the wind case, it would be the government, for example, saying, we're not just buying plain vanilla wind, we're going to put out a purchase power agreement for wind that behaves more like a thermal plant, that can dispatch or follow load. Very important. And you figure out how to do that, but we're open for business. And by the way, we're willing to pay a premium on top of market price for that. And we'll give you a 10, 12-year contract. That would reduce investment risk. Last comment of what probably not to do is the California PUC last week approved a storage mandate for utilities, something like 1.3 gigawatts or something like that by X date. What was interesting is you look through the decision and there's nothing about innovation. It's just almost assumed that if we create this volumetric demand that people will come up with better stuff. My guess is you're going to come up with is just a lot of big battery packs. And yes, there might be some incremental innovation around how to mass produce those things, but you're not going to get the more fundamental kinds of kind of more marginal ideas that are talking about. If I'm a utility executive and I have to have X amount of megawatts in place by X date, I'm going to take what's off the shelf, which is these large battery arrays that are like being deployed in Texas, which are horrendously expensive and don't have gigawatt day storage potential, which is really what you're going to need to make wind viable. So, congratulations on the report. I think the next step is to sort of figure out what this smart deployment regime really looks like and get pretty granular. And I think there might be more consensus around that than we might imagine. Thanks.
All right, Jane, you're up next if you want to unmute.
Okay, can you guys hear me all right?
Loud and clear.
Okay, good. Armin's comments were terrific and just sort of right up the same alley that I'd like to talk about. I think the lesson from the two important lessons from the California study that I think are really important is the importance of having a goal. That the kinds of decisions and foci that you develop, kind of innovation that you develop, really has to do with having a goal. So what's unique in California is that we have the goal, albeit it's only by executive order, of 80% below 1990 levels. And that changes the way you think about all the pieces, because it's not just making reductions, it's actually coming up with an energy system that works at that emission level. And that's a really different thought process. So for example, if you look at natural gas as something that's reduced emissions, it's people call it the bridge fuel, but when you think about having a goal of 80% reductions, you can't just get on the bridge, you've got to get off the bridge. And that means that you have to start thinking about how you're not going to use fossil fuel, or how you're going to sequester it. And that is a more strategic approach. The other lesson is that these innovations are probably best done in our world at the regional level. And so I think the kinds of innovation that you're talking about, we seem to be completely paralyzed at the global level, and the place that seems to be possible to make an impact and still have an ability to act, an ability to actuate things is at the regional level. So I think that's really important. As we did this, I think there were three kinds of rules that come up when you're making these plans that would lead to innovation. Two are kind of more straightforward. You've got to get the accounting right. You've got to think right about how you count things. You can't count them twice, and you've got to count everything at once and include everything. That as you do regional plans, you don't want to get into a situation where you innovate by causing someone else to increase emissions. So, City of San Francisco says we're going to reduce emissions by not selling HHD hydropower to anyone else anymore. We're just going to use it all ourselves, and therefore instantly our electricity system is decarbonized. That doesn't wash if that would not create a regional plan that was additive with others to solving the problem. So that's a rule. And the third, which is the most difficult, and one which Armin and I have been talking a lot about, is the feasibility one, which is really the focus of what you guys are talking about. And feasibility is a really, really difficult thing to evaluate and to understand how to make a feasible system. We've spent a little bit of time now looking at what are the elements of making a feasible electricity system that's decarbonized. And most of these analyses that I've seen to get to 80% reductions require that electricity be almost completely decarbonized. And that is sort of where the focus of innovation needs to be. I recently ran a workshop this summer on trying to understand what the elements were of choosing an electricity system. And we looked at 5 different parameters, which would become the foci of the kind of innovation that we need. So the first is what the full system requirements are. What do you actually need? And here's where we get into the things that Megan and Matt were talking about with storage and other pieces of the system that need to be looked at. It's quite useful, I think, to think of that as on a time scale that everything from sub-hourly to seasonal time scales where the system has to be reliable and you have to have the pieces there to deal with it, and the types of technologies you're going to need along that spectrum from sub-hourly to the gigawatt day problem to seasonal mismatches as we build this out. And then, what we're seeing quite clearly is that when you take generation technologies, low carbon generation technologies off the table, it makes it extremely important that you realize what it is you're buying, but you're buying the need to make this reliable on all these different timescales. The second place to innovate is how fast we can build these things. I mean, reality is that it's 80% really by mid-century, and and if we don't make mid-century, I think the right policy is as fast as you can. There are other competing interests, but the goal needs to be pretty much zero and pretty much as fast as you can. So some of these things, when you build them, are tiny little bits here and there, and you fight just as hard as a big nuclear power plant. Well, that's an impact that we need to be thinking about. Innovation on cost is obvious, but really tightly linked to these system requirements that we need to understand that when you're buying, you can make a cheaper solar cell all you want, and it is going to really affect the major cost in the long run. Because in the end, other pieces of the system are going to become the dominant ones and need to be thought of in the whole system. Another issue is other ancillary impacts, and then the policy frameworks that we need for doing that. So that's kind of a frame for the electricity part. And then I would just add one thing. I think the biggest technical innovation need is going to be in fuel. That we just we're going to possibly get the biofuel promise. Maybe we will, maybe we won't, or maybe that's not the right way to put it. We will get some biofuel promise. We don't know how much of our problem it will solve. It's very unlikely that it's going to solve the whole problem. And the innovation required there, the technical innovation required there is enormous. So I think that's kind of a frame for where I think some of the points that Megan and Matt have been making need to get applied into the innovation in innovating our future. Thanks.
Thanks, Jane. Margot?
Hi, I'm from the Bipartisan Policy Center, so I'm going to kind of look at these issues through a different frame, which has to do perhaps with a national policy frame or a political frame. But first, congratulations on the report. What I really liked about the report is the much more sophisticated arguments that you brought to the table about innovation. It's not a catch-all for a million different things. There's a better way to have the conversation, to compartmentalize what we're all talking about, and so I think it was helpful to get the vocabulary out there and to start to break it up into deployment, R&D, commercialization. All of that adds a patina of a more detailed conversation that we need to be having. So congratulations on that. The Bipartisan Policy Center's American Energy Innovation Council that Matt mentioned has issued a couple of reports that have similar kinds of recommendations, particularly on the R&D side, and the need for the federal government to invest a lot more in R&D from the public sector. They didn't go so much into the details about deployment policies versus energy R&D, but we're very much cognizant of the fact that we're way under investing at the public level on R&D and need to do a much better job. Of course, all this reminds me of the very famous fable about the mice and the cat. You know, this one where the mice are getting beaten up and ambushed by the cat that lives in the house. And the mice said, what we need to do is put a committee together and come up with some great ideas. So they put a committee together and they came up with some great ideas. And the great idea was, let's bell the cat, and we'll know when the cat's coming. And of course, the wise mouse, the head of the committee, said, that's a great idea, but who's going to bell the cat? So I look at a lot of these things like these are all great ideas, but who's going to bell the cat? We've got to have much more acceptance at a federal level or at state levels that we need to have a plan, as Jane said, or that we need to be marching towards a clean energy future. That's a hard conversation to have these days. And part of the reason it's hard to have that conversation is because of the tremendous and fundamental changes that have happened in the energy sector in the last 8 years. Jane mentions natural gas, huge revolution there. Some call it a bridge to the future, some call it a bridge to nowhere, but nevertheless, it's a bridge. And it's very much driving down the cost of some fuels. It's very much driving down coal, chasing coal out of the market. It's very much creating a conversation on its own that's different from this conversation. We've had a revolution in energy productivity and energy efficiency that people don't talk so much about, that is going pari passu with the discussions in energy technology and how they can drive down emissions. It's important to keep focusing there. It's important, I think, to go beyond the power sector. A lot of the report was focused power sector. I agree with Jane. There's a lot that we need to be doing in the transportation sector. It's a big chunk of our emissions, not only in the U.S., but globally. That's a critical piece of this puzzle as well. The big cliche in this town, of course, is to talk about all of the above when you're looking at energy sources. I think all of the above in the policy space is critical as well. Like Armand, I think of it as a continuum of needing a range of policies to tackle different kinds of technologies and different places in the technology cycle. I agree. I think many people agree that things like the PTC and the ITC are at best third best policy instruments. But the risk that you take in saying let's get rid of those and replace it with something else is you get rid of them, but you don't replace them with something else because of the difficulty to get some agreement with this particular Congress and probably the Congress next term and the term after, is to find a way to replace bad things with things that are at least as bad or better. And that can be difficult. So while economists and technicians can argue about the relative benefit of the different instruments we've got, that's what we've got. And so you kind of have to work with this pool of not so great things and kind of figure out where you go from there, because you're never going to get your first best. So let's see, contacts, all the above, AEIC, I think that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Just to kick off, discussion. Just I think to add to, theme there is, can we actually have this innovation and smart deployment discussion? Does the politics around this even allow it? I think back to the PTC extension. Really, the debate was we either get rid of it or we don't. Yet this kind of smart deployment discussions fall somewhere in between, and you almost have to remake the entire narrative of the clean energy policy debate first before we can get to that. Is that even possible? Can we actually get there?
Yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. You have to have groups like this continuing to talk about it and people coming up with a new language and a new way to talk about it. During the Stimulus Act, we were talking a lot about the green jobs part of all of this. It was a different kind of a conversation. So I think we may not see progress in any legislation this year or a big influx in R&D money, but you have to keep having the conversation, and you have to figure out a way to engage people to have that conversation and realize what the balances are in something that they want to promote versus something that you want to promote. So you have to keep having the conversation. There's no other alternative.
Yeah, Matt, I would agree with that. I think that that just getting reports out like this to start discussion are part of that, because you're obviously in favor of climate action, but you're also saying, as we are, maybe the instruments we have are not the best ones. When I talk to conservative friends, their reaction is often, clean energy, that's just pork. That's just more corporate interest feeding at the trough, more of what we don't need. It's just it's just carving up an existing pie. The hypothesis that has to be tested is if something were put out there that said, well, we would like to do things differently. We'd like to have a conversation about doing things differently that really moves the ball, that moves technologies closer to cost parity beyond what the current instruments have been able to do. Maybe there's an opening. We don't know. I don't think it's really been tested. That this middle space hasn't really been tested. What we've had is kind of an Armageddon fight over the world's going to end tomorrow if we don't continue to deploy current wind plants at our current pace through the current instruments versus this is all a bunch of hooey and this stuff will never be cost effective. And I think hopefully maybe folks learned something last week, that there is some kind of moderate center left in this town that could begin to sort of have that conversation, but we won't know until we try.
I think that maybe to add on to that, I always go back that this discussion is really about, is today's clean energy technologies ready for prime time? And that's kind of it's seen in the climate debate as a very bad question to ask. Like if you immediately ask that question, you're trying to find some way out of doing clean energy or anti-clean energy. But is there room in the debate for asking that question? Should we be afraid to ask that, to say that no, today's technologies can't get us 80%. They may be able to get us 15 or 20% if we really deploy them, if we really subsidize and mandate them. But we really do need good technologies, better technologies. Is there room for that?
I think you want to have that debate if you're a clean energy advocate. I think you want that debate, and the reason you want it is you otherwise might run into a brick wall. And again, this is what I fear what's going to happen in Germany is, for those of you who are following this, as I said, the renewable charge is already up to 6 cents a kilowatt hour. They really haven't begun to figure out how they're going to integrate that level of wind into the German system. They're dumping power into Czechoslovakia, relying on Polish coal. And they're only at 15% wind and solar, and it's already a very significant cost piece to the point where it's become a political issue. So I think, Matt, clean energy advocates had better raise this issue on our own and deal with it. You can be in denial, but the facts are there, and the political pressures are going to be there, as you indicate in your report. And some of these innovations will take some time to take hold. It took 20 years to get wind down that curve. So there is going to be definitely a political debate, but unless we get ahead of this one and frame it in a constructive way, folks who don't want to see anything happen will reframe it just nicely.
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult problem. I see a lot of cognitive dissonance between what I call the Bill McKibben approach and the sort of analyst of, kind of technical analyst that we're all promoting right here. The issue is that you have the context of society not wanting to do anything, and then people like Bill McKibben trying to motivate them. But the kinds of things that get chosen to motivate them are not necessarily the ones that make sense to solve the problem. And that's I think we have a real problem with trying to stitch those edges together and try to understand what would motivate people at the same time actually solve the problem. So, the problem is renewable energy has been kind of the sweet spot where the economic interests and the political interests and the economic interests, the security interests and the climate interests have overlapped. So trying to get that zone of overlap, what people are interested in and how to promote is part of the issue. So, for example, if you take this all renewable future, or even the more extreme, the Jacobson all wind future, and really tease out what's involved in it. What else, say, fine, let's do it. Now, here's all the things we have to do to get it done. I don't know how that would work, but it seems to me to be an extremely important piece of the puzzle to try to get motivation on the part of the people who want to solve the climate problem to embrace more technologies.
Well, I think you bring it out nicely in the report that it's a global issue, that no matter what we do here, and we can look at many different options to get a lower carbon future accelerated, but this issue of how you then transfer that to countries that are having much faster growth in emissions than we do, it is really daunting. So a lot, I think, of what we've been talking about here is how you get motivation in the United States, but the global issue is very difficult.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. One issue that I don't think you really go into in the report, but it's playing off of Margot's point here, is the role of the U.S. innovation system in the global context. We do a lot of work in China, and one thing that we've seen in China, in addition to some basic innovation, which people don't think is going on there but really is the mass deployment. And I think maybe some smarter thinking about how do you couple an extremely innovative economy like the U.S. with a lot of R&D capability and basic invention capability that doesn't have much by way of energy markets right now, and not a lot of political tolerance to pay above market prices, very low gas prices. I mean, the bogey's constantly moving, right? If we were still, if combined cycle gas turbines were still, costing 10 or 12 cents, you'd have more room for some of this stuff. But they're not costing that. They're like more down to 6 or 7. The question of how does China play with this is an interesting one. What we're observing in China is, at least in the nuclear area, is that they seem to be able to build these Generation 3 reactors, 3+, like the AP1000s. They seem to be bringing them in at costs well below the Western levels. Solar panels, another example. The crash in the global solar panel market was largely due to the Chinese production capability, and whether that was subsidized or not, is for folks to debate. But the point is there a way to think about this as, and I think this is pushes more in the direction of the report, is the U.S. is going to be this incredible engine of invention, basic research, applied research, commercial demonstration, and maybe the build out for the time being is in other parts of the world until we catch up and actually need the capacity. I'm not sure I actually believe that may be a cartoon, but it's at least one way to think about how you might have your cake and eat it too is that there's a lot of tech transfer going on. The AP1000 is a good example. That's a Westinghouse technology that we're building 4 in the U.S., but they're going to build probably 50 of them in China or something like that. And they're bringing them in at lower costs. By the way, they're doing the in-use innovation that might bring those costs down that then can be reapplied in the U.S. So it's a global innovation system now. I don't know how that affects the thesis of the report. I think it argues probably that the U.S. sweet spot will remain maybe more on the upstream end, and the brute force deployment, incremental refinement might be elsewhere in the world.
Maybe to switch gears just a little bit, one of the criticisms I hear most often is that innovation takes too long. We have this challenge that we have to do by mid-century, and we just can't wait for innovation. It's too uncertain. We don't know what we're going to get out of that. So we have a higher probability of solving this if we just deploy what we have. Is there merit to that, or is that taking too much of a simplistic view of innovation?
Well, there's merit to the idea that we need to deploy what we know about, and that's there's a lot of stuff we know about. So you shouldn't negate that works. I mean, nuclear power would work. We know how to do it. So I mean, not that there's not innovation required to get to more advanced technologies, but I think the need to deploy is what we know is there really the right policies but in terms what we need to have a strong deployment incentive, and that will drive innovation too.
I mean, essentially, these are economic and policy problems, right? I mean, that yes, we should deploy what we know, but if there's no incentive to do so, that's where the nexus is. It either has to be cost effective for those that are doing the deployment, and that you make that cost effective either by driving the cost down or through some sort of policy mechanism that helps you along. So I mean, it's an obvious thing to say, but essentially these are economic and policy questions, and certainly there are technology questions. You bring out any number of them in the report, making sure that we've got the right kind of technologies and the incentives for 3rd, 4th, 5th generation technologies. But you get down to, we've got a lot of technologies that are deployable now, but then why aren't they being deployed?
I mean, I think even if innovation takes a long time, the sooner we start, the sooner we'll see results. So I don't know if the timeline argument is really relevant in any case. I mean, if we invest significantly in innovation, we're sure to see breakthroughs, and we've seen it in other industries as well, and now it's time for energy.
That's a good point.
If there are any questions from the audience. Sure. If you can just say your name.
Sure. Good morning. I'm Untitled. I'm with Senator Chris Coons of Delaware, working on energy policy. So first of all, I want to congratulate Megan and Matt with yet another excellent contribution to their ongoing work highlighting the need for an integrated innovation policy in the energy sphere. Really look forward to digging into it, and thank you for the contribution. So I guess I wanted to ask about this term, the deployment consensus, and you seem to be arguing that we haven't reached the scenario outlined in the deployment consensus, and we can't therefore flip the focus to deployment to later stages in the pipeline. So my question is that seems to imply that there may be some point that we'll realize maybe multi-junction cells will enter commercialization, and we'll decide, okay, now this is it. We've reached the deployment consensus scenario, and we can flip the bulk of our resources from the early stages to the late stages. So my question is, first of all, I'm not sure you could ever get to, how would you know that was, I know I'm setting up a straw man, but how could you know that you got to that stage? Could there ever be consensus that we've reached it? I mean, wouldn't that be committing what is the original sin of energy policy, which is picking winners and losers? And also, I'm wondering if it makes sense to say that we can reach a point that we have the energy we're going to go and take and run with it, because you look at telecommunications, there seems to be a revolution every generation. So it's not like you get to that point where you get the services you want and then you run with it. Of course, maybe energy different.
I think I go back to James' point that it's important to have a goal. when the Defense Department wants to improve its its fighting capability, it'll say something like, we want a bomber that flies without being detected in radar, all right? And then they work with a bunch of contractors and they figure out who can do this, and they get it delivered in some period of time. I think that energy equivalent is, we want wind plants that follow load and that don't have to be curtailed and that provide ancillary services and those sorts of things. We want a carbon capture and storage plant that does 90% capture at less than X dollars per kilowatt hour. Now, those targets may constantly shift, but you got to start somewhere. So I would argue that how will you know when you get there if you don't know where you want to go? So the first step would be, and this is what Department of Defense does really well. We put out a whole report on why they get so much done. Well, first they spend $60 billion a year on R&D and another $120 billion on deployment, and they are their own customers. So that's an important distinction. But if you were going to mimic the best aspects of the DoD defense innovation machine, I'm not talking about the green part of it, but just killing people. The approach is to say, here is a place we want to be in 7-10 years. This is what we want to be able to deliver in the battlefield, and you go about doing that. So that's, I would argue for an innovation approach, which is a constantly adjusted portfolio of medium-term, long-term technology goals. The DOE has done some of this. The Sunshot program is an example of that. I think they were aiming for, what, $1 per watt installed watt, including balance of system. You could do, the government could go out and say, we're going to buy the first 400 megawatts of a small modular reactor at military bases, and here are the cost parameters. Over time, the first tranche is going to be this, and the second tranche we're going to lower the cost, and we'll do a reverse auction for the rest. So I think you need to put some market signals out there, or some bogeys for what you actually want, and I think, and then you can constantly debate whether it's the right portfolio or whether you ought to add something or tweak it. So, but you will never get to nirvana, because there's always going to be more that you can do, and so the analogy sometimes people use is that the little hand calculators that I used in high school in the 70s were like $400. But we used them because they actually provided some value. We bought them and used them, or some people bought them. People in the industry bought them and used them. Even though today the same thing is $1.50. But you had to kind of go through the $400 phase to get to the $1.50 phase, and so something similar, some kind of similar target goal setting. The defense people know how to do this. I mean, I think we could learn a lot from defense on this. If we look more like that in the energy sphere, I think we would have more definition, and we'd know what success and failure is.
So, I think those are interesting comments, and I think that one of the things I brought up a few minutes ago was the idea that we have these potential sweet spots, that work for society. I think we don't generally agree on the goals. We generally agree on methods. I mean, and the fact is, whether or not we agree on the goals doesn't really matter. It's whether we agree on the methods is whether we actuate what we're going to do. And so the question is, how do you start to appeal in defining these, these actions, like you just described, like we're going to we're going to set up the Sunshot type thing. How do you go through and make it appealing to people who don't care about the climate, who care about the economy, or who care about energy security, or whatever other pieces they really care about? And Texas is a really interesting example, right? They have no interest in climate, but have really moved their wind power forward, certainly not for climate reasons. So, I think one issue is to try to understand how you can appeal to a broader base of interests.
In the back.
Yeah, hi, my name is Joel Yudkin, High Road Strategies in Arlington. Just following up a little bit of what you're saying, of course the DoD is already investing and already moving in the energy area with their renewables program, the biofuel program, and so on. And what you're describing is they both work on a demand pull side and a supply push in terms of investment. I mean, they do the full package. You invest in the technology, but all the way down to the basic research level up to the actual deployment and procurement. And I think one of the important things here, and I guess it's the question, is how do we create a similar demand pull while also creating the incentive for those investments or building that into that on the energy side? Do we do it through the DoD, which is the only federal agency is now allowed to have any money? And I think that raises the question about how do you create, one of the reasons people get out and support Republicans and Democrats is because defense is a mission that everybody, at least to some extent, supports, that we think we needed for our national defense. And the question is, so there seems to be a chicken and egg kind of thing I'm a little worried about. I mean, there seem to be some, you're identifying technical and technological obstacles that need to be addressed in order to deploy at this, and that's costly. On the other hand, if you create the right environment, which as Armin, you were pointing out, the Department of Defense has done in technology and after technology, starting with, even before microprocessors to internet and so on. Can you replicate that here? Are all these technological problems, I mean, are there real technical limits what we can do with these? But going back to that model of defense, then you can start funding a whole lot of other options to explore that, because you're giving permission at that level to have failure, but the mission is something we all want to achieve. And so I think you're raising the right point. I just don't know how to, can we create a demand pull? And if that means that the Bill McKibben's and the technical and economic issues have to be joined somehow, where you're motivating on some level, but you're driving the willingness to invest and do the kind of things through federal agencies and state agencies. I mean, I'm sorry to kind of give a long little speech, but I'm just wondering, I think it's an important line of direction we need to work in.
I mean, feeding off of Armin's point, I mean, the Department of Defense is kind of its own economy, right? They're creating the demand, they're creating the supply. Right. So it's a more closed and controlled environment. They create a need. They try and figure out what the need is. Now, the coda to some of that is that, in fact, there is a lot of concern about the cost of doing this, right? In the last couple of years, they've been under the gun for spending too much money to develop renewable fuels, for example. So, yes, they are getting some steady funding now, but they too are part of the criticisms of spending too much on things that shouldn't cost so much. And I think it's also so they can have a goal, they can create the market. I think the goal setting is absolutely key, and how you do that outside of the DoD is, I think, something that we're all struggling with. And having a goal is also related to this point that I wanted to get to about picking winners and losers. And I think it can be kind of a canard to have to use that language, because the United States picks winners and losers all the time. The reason that we haven't developed mass transportation but developed lots of roads is because we were betting on car industry. So we do kind of pick winners and losers, and it's never usually done as sort of this top-down Gosplan, where everybody all agrees that's the plan, then we march forward, and all the policy instruments go towards that. It's a big, messy system, and it's why we like the DoD model is because it's a cleaner kind of closed system, and you can see that they have a demand for certain kinds of energy, and they can then create the supply to kind of meet that and experiment a little bit, and one hopes that a lot of that will have feedback effects to the rest of the economy. But I think we're all struggling with how do you do that outside of these more closed systems, and part of it is to have a plan. And I don't mean, again, a 5-year plan. I mean doing the kinds of things they do at the Department of Energy, create plans for research programs. And that's a critical piece of it, because we're not going to solve it because we're all going to essentially agree on one way to march forward. It's going to be lots of different fits and starts at the Department of Agriculture, at the Department of Energy, through their research programs, through commerce, through trade negotiations and trade mechanisms. It's going to be a lot of messy different things that are ultimately going to get us towards a lower carbon future. And we'd like it to be one big thing, but I don't think you can duplicate the Department of Defense approach for the economy writ large, in large part because most of the people that are consuming and producing energy are in the private sector. And they're making decisions based on a whole bunch of other signals other than how do I get to low carbon, right? So they're responding to lots of different pressures in order to do the investments that they need to make for the next 5, 10, 15, 30, 40 years.
I think one of the things we try to point out in the report is that there is this already a base for energy innovation in the U.S. with especially ARPA-E, talk about the Department of Defense and energy. That's, I think, where the clearest role is. Through the national labs, which we just released a big report on reforming the national labs to make them connect more research to market, through the Energy Frontier Research Centers, through the innovation hubs. So we have all these tools, and I think one of the problems that we have to face right now is kind of connecting all of those tools to make this energy innovation ecosystem cohesive. What are the roles for ARPA-E? What is the role for the national labs? What is the role for the Frontier Research Centers? And how can all of those things fit in? Where's the connective tissue? And I think ARPA-E is one of the best examples of a good goal maker. They put out these FOAs with these dramatic goals that really push the envelope on energy technologies, and then expect people to come and then they invest in their technology. And unfortunately, ARPA-E's budget is threatened, like many other things in the Department of Energy, and the House Appropriations wants to cut their budget to $50 million for next year, and that's just not really feasible for what they're proposing to do. So it still is, we can use the base that we have, but we have to fund it at levels that are appropriate for it to work.
I wonder if the mechanics and the politics might be somewhat connected in a helpful way. So your question really, you asked really two questions. One is, can we replicate that end-to-end strategy capability that DOE has from basic research all the way to putting something into the field? The answer is probably no, not in that form, unless folks are willing to turn DOE into that overnight. But I think Marga's right. You can rationalize pieces of the system and take pieces we have. I wonder if it's a question, not a statement. I wonder if there were a strategy or a theory articulated that knitted all these pieces together and said, we actually have 7 or 8 major goals in these technology areas. Whether that might provide more political support, because at least it's coherent. You might disagree with one or other piece of it, but I think to a lot of folks on the Hill in particular who look at the current energy sort of mix of subsidies and programs, they just see kind of like, well, you've got this wind industry that's feeding off of the ITC and PTC, and you got the solar people who are undermining the business utility model, but it's not really cost effective. Those are not my words, but that's how it's seen, is you've got this mishmash of policies that don't really have a goal except this vague sort of, climate nirvana or something, or jobs, or whatever the flavor of the day is. But if, one thing that DOD does, and I think DOD does, that the Department of Energy is trying to do is, every 4 years they sit down and they say, okay, what are our major innovation targets? What are our major strategic goals? And how do we deploy our existing resources to meet those? You might find more coherence. There's actually a lot of money in the world being spent on clean energy right now. Bloomberg said $265 billion last year. It's going to be down to probably about $210 billion this year, but that's a lot of money. That's a significant percentage of global GDP. And so I just wonder if there was a roadmap of some kind that that could be debated, discussed quadrennially, and then some coherence and a game plan. Whether you might find people who otherwise just see waste and pork suddenly say, well, actually this looks pretty systematic and worth investing in. I don't know.
So you're referring to the quadrennial energy review.
So the quadrennial energy review is, I think Secretary Moniz is like right on with your point. I think he's asking the same questions, and I think that the real question is, can there be enough agreement across the political spectrum to kind of support that kind of thing? But again, it's instead of just a clamor of interests, each arguing. The energy scene on the Hill is every person comes in and argues for their own little gizmo. And I think that there doesn't seem to be any voice saying, there's this broad portfolio we have to make. I know it's a cliche, but we need the portfolio. We're going to need everything and more. And if someone were to step forward, that's unclaimed political space right now, I think.
Hi, I'm Elisa Wasserman with National Governors Association. I'm curious to hear any thoughts on what those smart deployment policies might be, if you've seen any at the state level, And then also just wanted to make a comment about the California storage. I would question the argument that that's not an innovation oriented. I think it's very much so. When you think about, there is no market for storage on a large scale right now, and this is our first policy that really establishes a market. So you're going to see incremental improvements, maybe not the fundamental, but right now you have no market signal. This is the first one oriented towards that. And when you think about, if you just set these long-term innovation goals like solar, those goals have been around for 40 years. We still haven't seen that price that they've been aiming for. So you really need to have that merger of the deployment and R&D together.
Yeah, I just want to react to the California thing and just maybe sharpen my comment a little bit. I don't object to procurement. That's going to be a lot of money. I mean, at current prices, I mean, we're talking about storage is very expensive. The question is, so that's probably a multi-billion-dollar program, effectively, that the ratepayers are going to pay for in California. The question I would have is, why was the order written in a way that it's anything goes? I think my prediction is that everything will gravitate towards the sort of stuff that's on commercial offer right now. Couldn't a portion of that 1 gigawatt or 1.3 gigawatts be set aside for innovative technology that has the following character? That's really what I was saying, is that couldn't you build in an explicit innovation component? We may get lucky, and maybe just the sheer size of that market is going to lead to some very significant, breakthroughs in technology. So that was really my argument, is that could we at least ask the question? And it wasn't clear to me that question was really even being asked when the policy was being designed. That said, I have no doubt that we're going to get a lot of experience building large-scale battery farms. There's no question about it, and we'll probably see a decrease in the cost. The question is, is that going to look a little bit like wind, where we sort of seem to have reached kind of a plateau, and without thinking about that next step. So.
Yeah, so I can go over some of the policy recommendations that we kind of suggest as for reforming this idea of smart deployment. And I guess we define smart deployment as policies that are more directly linked with research to market. So right now, deployment policies are shaped around like subsidizing clean energy, but with no performance or cost metrics. They can apply and they get the subsidy, and that's great, but we would really like to see that changed and to make sure that the technologies that are receiving the subsidy are pushing the envelope and really trying to become more innovative and meeting cost metrics and performance metrics that we determine are or becoming competitive with fossil fuels. So some suggestions for how to reach these goals. Our biggest recommendation always is increasing funding for public investments in research, development, and demonstration to $15 billion per year. Right now, we're at about $5 billion per year, so it's effectively tripling spending. Another recommendation that we've pushed through several outlets is to create dedicated revenue streams for research, development, and demonstration, because right now we depend on appropriations processes. We just don't see the substantial public investment that we need. So we just released a report this summer that recommends using revenues from drilling on public lands to support ARPA-E to $1 billion per year, which is its recommended funding level. Another recommendation that we have is to reform the national labs so that they can better connect research to market. That's what they're supposed to be set up to do, and it would really be awesome if they could just do that. And I mean, most of these policies that we suggest are overcoming the valley of death, which we haven't really talked about, but I think is the underlying argument in this whole the deployment consensus challenge, is acknowledging the valley of death exists and then figuring out how to overcome it.
And maybe going back to the smart deployment, I mean, the problem is that most of the smart deployment occurs through government procurement, because that's where your performance metrics tend to be. So we're trying to replicate that type of system through tax incentives or some subsidy systems. And so I think we're in an opportunity with the PTC set to expire in December. The solar industry is already ramping up reforming the ITC, which is set for 2016. So there's some opportunities there. And there are other, I think examples, for instance, Japan has a top runner program for energy efficiency appliances that sets a performance metric, and then once the market meets that, it kind of resets it to whoever the leader is, so to get the subsidy or to get the incentive. So I think, and there's also some ties there with government procurement efforts. So there are ways of tying deployment incentives to kind of ever increasing performance metrics, and I think that's where we need to be. And then going back to the previous comments about, what's kind of the nirvana, how do we know when to switch from maybe early stage support to later stage support? I don't think it's a matter of us picking that year and when that's going to happen. It's a matter of picking the incentives that kind of naturally support better and better and cheaper technologies over time. And we just simply don't have those incentives set up to do that in the U.S., or I think much of the world isn't doing that in clean energy.
Matt, just a follow-up comment on the states. I think they're neglected laboratories of experiment, to use Brandeis's famous phrase. So I could think of two states that are doing really important things right now: California, and this is going to surprise you, Georgia. Or Georgia and Mississippi, even more surprising perhaps. California is doing things like storage, and they've set goals in the electric vehicle space and that sort of thing. Interestingly, Georgia and is building first of a kind advanced passive safety reactors. And the Southern Company, with the support of the Mississippi Public Service Commission, is building the world's first 60% carbon capture coal plant. Those are unique circumstances. Those are regulated monopolies still. EPRI was funded by ratepayers and contributed significantly to the development of both of those technologies. But there is money at the state level. It's in the rate base. And failing a federal solution, I think there are some very creative things that could be done at the state level. Again, I would implore state policymakers, and maybe this is a role that the Governors Association could play, is to be starting this conversation at the state level, which is not just how can we get more clean in volume, but how can we move the ball technologically, and by the way, probably position our state as a result as having sort of the core knowledge that would be a useful export. Because where people build stuff is where you tend to get the expertise to refine and build. So I think most of this discussion implicitly tends to be Capitol Hill, but I think there are states that probably want to get out ahead of this, and I think maybe there's some discussion we could have about really trying to make some of these state programs smarter and interlinked and more strategic.
Well, and there's a golden opportunity to do that with the 111D requirements that are coming on that are all devolving to states to put up implementation plans to deal with whatever standard EPA is going to put out in June. But here's the perfect opportunity for states to continue to act as experimental lands to put in some of these recommendations so that they can get emissions lower in their power sectors that are more consistent with what the needs are in that region.
Hey, dude. Noah Ginsberg with the American Council on Renewable Energy, and I'm glad we're talking about states, because I actually think that's where the major players are really driving this energy conversation, which is seeing significant cost drops in things stemming from things like solar permitting, which is a policy innovation where there's these soft costs that are substantial, but they're figuring out ways. Chicago, for example, is looking into cutting permitting costs for solar panels because there's more of a reduction there in costs in regards to the soft costs of permitting than there probably is in the technology. And since we are talking about competitiveness with fossil fuels, I'm wondering a few things. One is, considering fossil fuels are mispriced, the IMF put out this report in April, are mispriced to the tune of $1 trillion a year globally. How does that play into this report? Because I feel like that's the elephant in the room where you're talking about, you need to compete with fossil fuel, but it's already sort of artificially priced. And the second thing is, what would an innovation strategy look like that can match, since 2008, in America, for example, we've had the doubling and more so now of renewable energy. Prices for solar panels have declined over 75% and wind power for 40%. And this is a global trend where deployment is really pushing this price decline. What innovation can match that steep price decline? What innovation policy, I should say, compared to the deployment policies that we've seen?
Well, to talk about the first point, the fossil fuel mispricing, I think it's a challenging question, obviously. I did my college thesis on mispricing of fossil fuels, and it's unfortunate, but if you take away all of the subsidies that go to fossil fuels and include all of the externalities that are involved, the price of fossil fuels goes up, but maybe not even still to the price of clean energy, and then you're just making the price of energy go up. And I don't know if that's necessarily something that we want to do. We want people to be able to afford energy, and I think the point of all of this discussion is to make clean energy maybe not to make it cheap enough that people will want to buy it without subsidies. So I don't know. It's kind of a nuanced argument. I understand it's difficult to capture the price of fossil fuels in the real way. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question then? So in states that have something called net metering, which is where you can sell back electricity to the grid, I know some have argued that that is a subsidy, but considering you can say the energy market is really not consumer-driven, you don't have a personal choice to buy your electricity from coal or solar power, but you put up solar panels on your house and you sell that electricity back to the grid. It's price competitive. In fact, you're reducing costs. How can you say that innovation can drive further price declines when states that have those policies are seeing prices more competitive than fossil fuel, but in states that do not have those policies, they're not? I mean, how can you say that that policy is really not driving the price?
We can't have the argument about grid parity here. I don't agree with your assertion. I'll just stipulate that, and we'll do that offline.
I think the issue here is that it's just not that simple. If you have a time of use rate payment coupled to the policies where people can sell back their electricity, then it doesn't have as much impact on everyone else. I mean, people who can afford to put the solar on the roof and get their money, not pay for electricity, are usually producing it in many places in California, they're producing it at a time when the utility doesn't need it. And so it's an impact on everyone else. And so it's just not that simple.
Yeah, I think so. Putting aside the cost question, which we're not going to agree on, I think, are we at grid parity or aren't we? The point you made, I want to acknowledge your point that deployment has moved us down the curve. There's no question. I think what we're seeing, though, certainly in the wind areas, we've seen a stall. I mean, it's been 20 years of deployment, but we're still. I mean, look at where offshore wind is, for example. We've done a lot of deployment in Europe. We're still above 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and that's without considering integration costs. Domestically, I don't know. US EIA says that we're on average at about 8.5 cents when ignoring subsidies. That's still not going to beat gas. So you're right. That's why I think that there are elements. There's a point at which you can move incremental innovation through mass deployment. But keep in mind that was 20 years of subsidies. That wasn't 5. I mean, that was a lot of money and a lot of time. So the question on the table is, can you speed that up by adding something to this mix? Whatever you're going to do on deployment, let's just say states want to just deploy the heck out of wind and solar, fine. The question is there something beyond that would get us out of this function and into that function? And that's really, I think, the question. You can do both at the same time, and I'm not sure it's really an argument of either or, unless you have a zero-sum politics, which I think is what is now being seen in Germany. Is people just may not be able to swallow as much as folks think they are. They do, and it may be that they'll just do it and they'll double the cost of electricity, which is kind of what they seem to be on track to do right now. But and that's fine if they want to do that. I'm not sure that's going to be a sustainable policy in the U.S.
One lesson from California that I think is really interesting, and it speaks back to something that Margot said, is that it is really messy. So the bottom line is that California has the goal, and then there's all these multiple overlapping, sometimes even conflicting policies that attack the problem with various policy instruments. So you have the low carbon fuel standard as well as the cap and trade. They have a regulatory approach to the carbon content of fuel. as well as a market approach. And you have this generalized goal of AB 32, and you have long-term power purchase restrictions on emission control. So you know, there's just all kinds of, which requires the regions in the state to plan to reduce emissions by according to the AB 32 goal, and tells them to do it any way they can, but they have to have a plan that shows they're going to do it. So I think that what I see happening is that you see kind of nudging away at the problem in all different directions, but the fundamental thing is the goal. You know, if you don't have the goal, it becomes extremely difficult to affect this. So that's I think that'll, you know, a lot of these questions get answered when you have the goal.
I think we have time for one more question. Or I'll take moderator's appeal. I guess when we'll end, I think we'll end with, I think any policy event has to end with a policy question. So I think the high level question is kind of where do we go next? I feel like the next, I dare say 12 months are really critical. We have, you know, sequestration budget cuts are cutting R&D at the federal level. The PTC expires in December, but there may or may not be room for conversation on how we could reform it. RPE may get zeroed out or significantly less than what it's at now. You know, the national labs are being looked at for reform and potential cuts there. With budget committee, you know, issues, and so I feel like we're in this very tough policy environment, particularly at the federal level. You know, so where does kind of a more innovation-focused energy policy go from here?
Well, I think the budget issues are difficult. I always have to feel I have to point out that we love RPE. We've advocated very strongly for RPE. RPE, even when fully funded, not AEIC funded or funded the way you want it funded, is a small part of what the Department of Energy does in terms of its R&D work. A lot of it happens in EERE and it's in science budgets, and it's important not to lose sight of what they're doing and how important they are in the whole mix, even though RPE is kind of the nice shiny object that we all like to look at. I think it is a different environment, but I think a difficult environment. I think having the kind of conversation that you're trying to push is important. You may not get a result right away. And so kind of the question you have to ask yourself is it better to keep PTC around and try and advocate for PTC or changing PTC around the edges, or saying, oh, what the hell, just let it expire and we'll hope to pick up something else at a later date. Advocating to reduce tax expenditures or subsidies in the oil and gas sector is probably not going to happen, you know, unless you are willing to also look at comprehensive tax reform, and that's a long, hard hill to climb, right? But those are important conversations to have, as is the conversation of how much you find different funding streams, and I think you've raised a couple of good opportunities for alternative funding streams, but having those conversations, but it all comes back to having the goal and having a shared desire that we're underfunding and we need to amp up that funding, and we need to do it in a time of great austerity. It's a zero-sum game. Somebody will get gored in order to fund this work. And having the conversation of what that might be is, you have to keep having that conversation. I think it's a very difficult policy environment, though. Oh, but having said that, we have some progress on the regulatory side. And you can't negate the impact of the 111D and 111B regulations that are coming under the Clean Air Act. Those are important drivers of future emissions reductions. Yes, we've got a ways to get through the rulemaking process and the legal process that will likely ensue, but we're on this train, and this train is going to deliver emissions reductions at some time in the not too distant future, and it's an important part of the policy piece, an important part of signals for innovation.
Matt, I'll return to my original point, which is I think the conversation is really important because it may open up possibilities. Conversation in two dimensions. One is acknowledge the success of the traditional deployment programs, but also put on the table that we may be able to go to a next generation of programs as well, and that there may be better ways to spend the money, or at least additional ways to spend the money that will move us down that curve. So it may be that the political space opens up with reports like yours that say, you know, there are a lot of ways to skin this cat, and we don't have to keep doing the same thing. The other dimension of this, I think, was kind of in the elephant in the room today, and your report doesn't really address, which is, I think, for conservatives that I talk to, they see the clean energy thing as wind, solar, and energy efficiency, and you know, that carries certain baggage with conservatives. My organization is quite bullish on advanced nuclear. Actually, we're quite bullish on the advanced passive safety reactors. I personally think they're the only things that are going to scale at terawatt scale in the time frame we need. If that's thrown into the conversation, if carbon capture and storage at large scale is thrown into the conversation, you might find people say, oh, well, okay, they're really about advanced technology. They're not about a certain class of technologies that they favor, and that may open the conversation too. Jane alluded to this. If you take my own view on decarbonization is that if you take any one of those elements, whether it's CCS or nuclear or wind, out of the equation, you've increased the difficulty of meeting the target. So maybe a combination of more eclectic approaches to the kinds of technologies we're willing to think about innovation on and deployment of, combined with a more open conversation about the techniques. And I think, you know, think tanks like ITIF can play a role in that. You probably need a dedicated cadre of staff on the Hill and in the administration who are going to work to work through these ideas, just like we're going to need on tax reform. The country's done it before. I mean, we've made major shifts before in policy areas, but it's going to take some ideas.
Just a comment that I agree with Margot. I think these state-by-state plans that are going to be agreed to between the states and EPA are really critical. And I think here there's a lot of work to be done to get people to understand what constitutes a good and what they, you know, how they can innovate and how they can do something meaningful. And to me, I think there's a need for outreach and training. I think people don't understand. You know, I'll say a new plan just came out in California, which is an update of the scoping plan, which is the, you know, how are we doing towards the 2020 goal, and what is our plan? How are we going to get an interim goal, a 2030 plan? And there's no question that the things that are being said in that plan are reflect strongly the kinds of analysis that was done in the state, by us and by other people. And I think that informing those plans are really important. And at this point, I know the mechanisms that they wanted, that the state is looking at, they don't know what choices they're going to make to get to this interim goal. They know they're going to try to set a 2030 goal under the existing legislation that they have and to try to come up with the mechanisms. I think we need to be supporting that negotiation, you know, to help people figure out how to knit together their policy direction.
All right, so I think we'll end it on that. Thank you very much for coming. And again, to continue the conversation, check out ourenergypolicy.org, and the report can be found at itif.org. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great.